Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Red Rock Railfan. It's been a while since my last mini documentary here on YouTube, but I promise the wait was worth it. This summer, I had the incredible opportunity to spend 2 months in the beautiful Flathead Valley of northwestern Montana. With Glacier National Park on one side and the Kootenai National Forest on the other, I was surrounded by some of the most stunning railroad scenery in the country. I took full advantage of it, capturing BNSF's busy northern transcontinental main line, the route linking Chicago and Seattle. In the first part of my 3-part Montana series, we're focusing on the Kootenai River subdivision, one of the more important yet often overlooked segments of BNSF's system. It tends to be overshadowed by its much more famous sister and neighbor, the Highline sub over Marias Pass, but it still has its own unique story. The Kootenai River sub was originally part of Great Northern's transcontinental route from St. Paul to Seattle. Construction began in 1870 and was completed in 1893. The first alignment through this area ran via Kalispell and Marion before meeting the Kootenai River at Libby. In 1904, a more favorable pass was found through Whitefish and Eureka, and the Great Northern built a new route along that corridor. But change came again in the 1960s. A treaty between the United States and Canada, with involvement from the Kootenai tribe, set in motion the construction of Libby Dam and the creation of Lake Kootenai. The reservoir would flood the existing tracks, forcing the railroad to relocate once again. The solution was to start 20 miles south of Eureka at Stryker, head due south, and rejoin the old line about 11 miles west of its original location, putting the total subdivision length at around 230 miles. This project included building the 7.1-mile-long Flathead Tunnel, completed in 1970, just in time for the Great Northern to merge with the Northern Pacific and the CB&Q to form modern-day Burlington Northern. My coverage this summer focuses on the Rock Creek to Whitefish stretch, which includes the Flathead Tunnel. Rock Creek sits near the eastern end of the Libby to Stryker segment, a roughly 70-mile stretch of track known for being among the most isolated on the entire BNSF network. While Libby lies another 48 miles west of Rock Creek, the portion we'll see captures the same remote character. No towns, no rivers, almost no roads, and nothing but forest and mountains surrounding the tracks. We'll start at Rock Creek, where the tracks immediately dive into the tunnel's west portal. From there, we'll see the tunnel flushing process at the east portal near Twin Meadows and learn how the system works. Continuing east, we'll pass Brimstone and Stryker, where the old Eureka branch still exists, before moving on to Radnor, Lupfer, Vista, and finally the crew change point at Whitefish. This video has it all: history, operations, and plenty of interesting trains and locomotives. So sit back, relax, and enjoy part 1 of BNSF and Big Sky Country. We start this railfanning adventure at Rock Creek. Located at milepost 1273.0, it is the last siding before eastbound trains dive into the Flathead Tunnel. Because of this, it is often used as a holdout for dispatchers to fleet trains going into the opposite direction. That is not the case today, as an empty grain train returning to eastern Montana clears east siding switch Rock Creek and plunges into timetable west portal of the Flathead Tunnel. now facing the west portal of the tunnel. Due to the tunnel being built perfectly straight with not a single bend in the rail, track speed is 50 miles per hour for all trains. Watch as this loaded grain train comes screaming out of the tunnel. Built in 1970, the Flathead Tunnel is 7.1 miles long and built on a gradient, as the east portal is much lower in elevation than the west. Because of this, Burlington Northern installed an incredibly sophisticated flushing process that BNSF uses and builds upon to this day. Here's how it works. The dispatcher lines a train through the tunnel. As the train moves through the tunnel, it emits diesel exhaust as it would anywhere else. Trains climbing tend to emit a significantly higher amount than trains coasting down grade do. You'll see why this is an issue later. The BNSF employee stationed at the tunnel monitors 3 sensors inside of it. Located a few thousand feet in on each side and one in the middle, these sensors read the combustible parts per million of the exhaust. As the train flies through the tunnel, and also for a few minutes afterward, the sensors climb up as the exhaust floats around. This is where things get complicated. If the sensor reports a reading above 2.0 combustible parts per million, the tunnel automatically enters a 15 to 25 minute flush cycle. If the sensors do not reach over 2.0 and start to fall, the dispatcher is allowed to line the next train through the tunnel so long that it is going in the same direction as the previous train. If the next train due through the tunnel is westbound and the last train was eastbound, the tunnel must be flushed regardless of the ppm reading. Here's why. As an eastbound train passes through the tunnel, the freight cars in tow drag the exhaust with it. So even after the train has fully exited the tunnel, the exhaust is still flowing through the tunnel at up to 22 miles per hour in the same direction. If the next train was lined through in the opposite direction, the onslaught of exhaust coming at the train would essentially asphyxiate the locomotive on that train. The locomotives need oxygen to run smoothly. So, how does the flush cycle work? At the east portal of the tunnel, there are 2,000 horsepower fans that spin at a very high RPM rate. They spin from anywhere between 15 to 25 minutes and flush the exhaust completely out of the tunnel. They are computerized and tied in with the sensors and dispatcher and turn on automatically when all criteria is met. When the flushing process is complete and the ppm reading is below 2.0 again, the dispatcher can line the next train through in any direction. Just east of the Flathead Tunnel is Twin Meadows siding. We see 2 trains here, first being a Pasco to Great Falls manifest, followed by a loaded grain train with a full CPKC lash-up, highlighted by CP7015, one of CP's maroon and gray SD70 ACUs. As we head towards the next sighting at Brimstone, we stop just east of where we caught the CPKC Grainer to catch an unusual GP60B booster unit as a quote-unquote nose-out DPU on a Pasco to Minot manifest. The crew of this westbound loaded crude train and myself take in the beautiful views of the Tobacco Valley at West Brimstone. The Tobacco Valley begins at Stryker and stretches up into Canada, and to the left of the frame is a direct view, weather contingent, across the border and into our northern neighbor. heights of West Brimstone are long gone by the time trains reach the eastern switch. What was once perched on top of the hill is now cutting through the bottoms of the forests of the Kootenai. Approaching fast is BNSF's daily Pasman as it clears East Brimstone and heads towards Stryker, with several locomotives dead in tow. On a cloudy and overcast day, a westbound Z train rips through Stryker with an increasingly uncommon Dash 9 unit leading. Located at milepost 1249.2, Stryker marks the beginning of where the Great Northern rebuilt their main line in 1970. The tracks in the foreground are the original right-of-way, which now belong to the Mission Mountain Railroad, a Waco-owned short line that specializes in interchanging Canadian lumber from Eureka, Montana to the BNSF right here at Stryker. There used to be two Ys here, but those have been overgrown and the frogs have been removed. The original right-of-way you see in the foreground has a simple passing siding just behind the camera, operated by two hand-throw switches. These two tracks are all that is needed for the MMT BNSF interchange that happens a few times a week. Radnor isn't much except for a simple passing siding, a talk-on defect-only defect detector, and a relatively disused spur track, as you can see in the foreground. Wedged in between a steep hill and a peaceful creek, the two trains we see here include a westbound manifest and a grain train. In between Radnor and Olney, I stopped to catch an eastbound empty crude train bound for North Dakota. This portion of track between the two locations runs along the shore of Upper Stillwater Lake. is located at milepost 1236.5, but is not listed on the official BNSF timetable. However, Olney has a handful of yard tracks that frequently house maintenance of way cars, as well as a non-exceptional reporting detector, as well as a great vantage point over the main line. Watch these next two trains from both sides of the track. Next up at Olney is a manifest train bound for the hump yard at Pasco. Leading the train is Norfolk Southern C44 ACM number 4108. This particular unit made its rounds across the Northern Transcon this summer. This was my third time seeing it lead. In the background to the right is an old wood chip loader that hasn't seen usage in several years. As we continue to close the distance to Whitefish, we take a look at Lupfer. A simple passing siding built on an S-curve, Lupfer is commonly used for meets with trains leaving Whitefish. The first train at Lupfer is an empty grain train with BNSF 4729, the Frankenbonnet unit, trailing third. With the rain starting and the vehicle train idling behind me in the siding, we once again see the CPKC grainer we saw at Twin Meadows just earlier in the day and going much faster at Lupfer. Vista is the last passing siding before eastbounds hit Whitefish. Often used as a holdout for crew changes, it is virtually impossible to access. Luckily for me though, I did find a small gap in the trees just a little ways past the west switch to catch this westbound Minneapolis to Pasco manifest. One of the Northern Transcon's most important duties is connecting the intermodal transfer facilities of Chicagoland, especially Cicero and LPC, with those of Portland and Seattle. An eastbound stack train loaded with imported products approaches Whitefish westbound in the late morning, bound for Elwood, Illinois. Next up, we have the Whitefish road switcher crossing the Whitefish River and returning back into the yard at Whitefish. This local spends half the week working the Kalispell branch between Columbia Falls and Kalispell, and the other half interchanging with the MMT at Stryker. Today's job is just now returning from Stryker with Canadian lumber in tow. We end part 1 of this series at CP West Whitefish at milepost 1220 on the Kootenai River sub. I am located just west of the West Whitefish control plant, where the single main becomes 2 and heads east. Departing Whitefish with a new crew is a westbound loaded crude oil train originating out of Epping, North Dakota, and bound for the export terminal at Arco, Washington. In the lead is BNSF 9264, an SD70 ACE, with a not-so-far-from-home Montana Rail Link unit trailing.